Last time we spoke about the Autumn Battle of Changsha. In late September and early October of 1941, the Chinese commander, Chen Cheng, focused on Yichang, a crucial Yangtze stronghold, whose loss would threaten China's position and the approaches towards Chongqing. Chen Cheng's plan tightened a ring around the city, while Chinese forces blocked Japanese reinforcement routes, including efforts to cut retreat lines at places like Jingmen and Dangyang. The battle's pressure was intensified by shifting momentum elsewhere. As the Japanese situation around Changsha became unstable, strained by supplies, exhaustion, and mounting casualties, the Japanese command began to withdraw north. Chiang Kai-shek used this to accelerate Chinese priorities, ordering a rapid capture of Yichang with a tight deadline. Inside Yichang, the defense turned tragic as Japanese troops faced encirclement, heavy artillery barrages, and desperate street-to-street fighting. This episode is Blood, Rain, and Flags, the last struggle around Yichang. Hello again and welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia, and so much more. Let's go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War and Eastern Front Week by Week podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if you want to do me a solid favor, please, if you have a chance, go check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, where we have just commenced the Second Sino-Japanese War. In a lot of ways, it's just visualizing this very podcast. And if you're looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of those, you get access to the exclusive podcast series. We're about to put episode 41 up as I speak. You get early access to all the content I make and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. While the struggle around Changsha occupied one half of the battlefield, another contest of equal consequence was taking shape farther west at Yichang. The two operations were not separate stories. They belonged to the same campaign, and each influenced the fate of the other. If Changsha was the city whose danger was plain to every observer, Yichang was the stronghold whose importance weighed most heavily on the calculations of the commanders. In the autumn of 1941, the outcome in one place could not be understood without the outcome of the other. For Chen Cheng, Yichang was more than a military objective. It was a wound that had never really closed. The city stood on the Yangtze at a point of major strategic value, tied not only to communications and transportation, but also to the defense of the river approach towards the wartime capital. When Yichang had fallen in June of 1940, it had done more than alter the front lines. It had left behind quite a humiliation. 3 Japanese divisions, the 3rd, 13th, and 39th, had seized the city after 12 days and nights of intense fighting. At 5 in the afternoon on June the 11th, a unit of the Japanese 13th Division under Tanaka Seiichi had broken in from the southeast. Chinese troops of the 18th Army, under Peng Shan and Liu Guangwen's 18th Division, fought a savage close-quarters battle inside the city for a full day and night, while Japanese forces of the 3rd and 39th Divisions pressed from the north. At 4 in the afternoon on June the 12th, with Deng Ping's battalion covering the withdrawal, the Chinese finally pulled out of Yichang, and it was lost. Men in the high command do not always remember defeat the same way as men who had actually fought through it. Soldiers tend to remember heat, hunger, the dead, or the exact corner where a friend fell. Commanders also remember those things, but they remember something else as well. Failure recorded in the language of responsibility. Chen Cheng could not forget that 20 Chinese corps had been beaten by just 3 Japanese divisions. At the time, Li Zhongren had commanded the operation. Now the chance to erase that old disgrace seemed to be passing into Chen Cheng's own hands. On September the 20th, he received 2 telegrams, one from the military commission and one from Chiang Kai-shek himself. From that point onwards, Yichang dominated his thoughts. By September the 23rd, the military commission approved Chen Cheng's request to transfer the 33rd Army Group of the 5th War Zone into the 6th War Zone for the coming attack. On paper, his position seemed quite powerful. He now had 14 divisions at his disposal. Yichang itself was held only by Uchiyama Eitaro's 13th Division and the Hayabuchi Detachment, together amounting to roughly 16,000 men. Even granting the usual Japanese superiority in training, firepower, and communications, and local tactical cohesion, the Chinese possessed absolute numerical advantage. By September the 28th, the Chinese units had reached their attack positions, and Chen Cheng set his operational designs into motion. The forces on the right bank were to attack first and pull the main body of the Japanese 39th Division southward. The 33rd Army would strike towards Qingmen, and then Dangyang in order to cut off the enemy's routes of retreat and reinforcement. Once these movements took hold, Yichang itself would be enclosed and then crushed. Li Jilian's 94th Army, Li Yanyan's 2nd Army, and Song Kentang's 32nd Army and other formations advanced according to the plan. On paper, the arrangement was pretty clear. On the ground, it had a bit of resistance. The Japanese defended from some strong fieldworks, and progress was quite slow. Earthworks, wire, trenches, and mutually supporting positions transformed every apparent advance into some pretty hard labor. The Chinese pushed forward, but not with much speed, at least not what Chen Cheng had wanted. Even a favorable comparison of troop numbers could not cancel the fact that entrenched Japanese forces, once determined to hold said positions, could impose quite a terrible price on any assault. By the 1st of October, Japanese troops outside Yichang began withdrawing into the city proper. Chen Cheng responded by ordering all troops to complete the encirclement. At last, the operation seemed to be reaching the decisive stage. The city was tightening under pressure. The ring was nearly closed. Yet at that very moment, time began pressing harder on both sides. On October the 2nd, both Chen Cheng outside the city and Uchiyama inside received telegrams that sharpened the crisis. The message sent from the Japanese 11th Army headquarters in Wuhan informed Uchiyama that the famous Tokyo Asakusa Art Troop was coming to Yichang to comfort the frontline troops. The Expeditionary Army headquarters in Nanjing had decided that, for political reasons, the troop could not be turned back merely because combat situations were pretty dangerous. Their purpose was moral. That such a message could arrive at such a time reveals much more about the Japanese wartime culture. Appearances, spirit, ritual, reassurances, and emotional theater of endurance still had to be maintained even when military reality was worsening by the hour. The telegram that Chen Cheng received was pretty different. Chiang Kai-shek's order stated with brutal directness, the Japanese in northern Hunan had begun to withdraw, and Chen Cheng was ordered to spare no effort to capture Yichang within 3 days. Chen Cheng stared at the message for quite some time. There was no need for any explanation. He understood at once what Chiang Kai-shek meant. The battle for Yichang had already consumed days of hard fighting. Chinese units had suffered substantial losses, but the essential fact stood over every map and every order. If Japanese forces disengaged from northern Hunan and reached Yichang in time to reinforce it, then all the efforts already expended might amount to nothing. The battle had become not only a contest of strength, but now it was a race. At nearly the same time, the command post of the Japanese 11th Army, at Yueyang, was confronting the other half of the same problem. On the night of September the 30th, the headquarters was brightly lit as Chief of Staff Isamu Kinoshita arranged reports, reconnaissance findings, and field messages before the army commander. The Japanese still possessed a valuable advantage. They had access to Chinese communication codes, but such intelligence could not solve every operational problem. They could not conjure food where there was none, restore exhausted bodies, or stop the battlefield from changing shape. By then, the Japanese situation around Changsha had become increasingly unstable. The Hayabuchi detachment, after entering the city, was entangled in fierce urban fighting with the Chinese 6th Provisional Division of the 79th Army. By the evening of September the 30th, neither side had eliminated the other side inside the city. Outside of Changsha, the Japanese 3rd, 4th, 6th, and 40th Divisions had assembled and kept major Chinese forces at bay. One element of the 3rd Division had even moved south by truck to Zhuzhou, 50 kilometers away, and occupied the abandoned city. Yet these outward signs of success concealed a serious weakness. The Japanese rear was fraying. Ammunition and food was running low. Divisions operating that deep into hostile territory could not sustain a prolonged campaign under such conditions. More than 10 days of uninterrupted movement and fighting had also produced rising non-combat casualties. Men were collapsing from fatigue along the march. Sickness increased steadily. Units that had looked formidable on the offensive were beginning to wear thin from inside. At the same time, Chinese remnants from earlier defeats, new reinforcements and formations that had regrouped after being thrown back were all watching for signs of weakness. Even if the Japanese divisions in Hunan still had the strength to fight several more actions, another question overrode everything else, that being Yichang. Yichang was not simply another point on the map. It was a strategic stronghold on the Yangtze and one of the key places from which Japan threatened Chongqing. The city also carried institutional memory. After its capture in June of 1940, the occupying troops had initially been ordered to withdraw for rest and reorganization, but Imperial General Headquarters had reversed that decision almost at once and demanded that Yichang be held after all. Troops already on the road had to turn back and retake a city that had been burned, stripped, and rendered difficult to occupy. Amongst those who had insisted most strongly that Yichang must be retained was Anami Gorchika, the vice minister of the army at the time. Now, Anami faced the consequence of that earlier instance. However attractive the gains in Hunan might appear, Yichang could not simply be sacrificed. Uchiyama's 13th Division was not strong enough to hold indefinitely without any relief. Anami looked at Hunan on the map, a rich province, beautiful and militarily tempting, much of it seemingly almost within reach. But strategy does not reward attachment. With great reluctance, he gave the order to retreat. On the morning of October the 1st, all Japanese divisions received the reversal instructions, and at 4 in the afternoon they were beginning their march north. For Xu Yue, this altered the entire meaning of the campaign. Since the beginning of the battle, he had known frustration, disappointment, and anger. Whatever private calculations he may have had about Chiang Kai-shek's strategic directive, Chen Cheng's political influence, his own mistakes in the earlier phase of operations, or the rivalries that had long poisoned Republican military life, none of those feelings prevented him from seeing the opportunity now before him. Once the Japanese turned north, pursuit was no longer merely a matter of salvaging dignity. It became an operational necessity tied directly to Yichang. His staff quickly drafted a pursuit order defining routes, timings, and methods. The document explicitly called for tracking and pursuing, interception, flanking movements, ambush, and surprise attacks. This was not to be a ceremonial following of a retreating enemy at a respectful distance. It was meant to be pressure, enough pressure if possible to delay Japanese movements back towards Hubei. 2 hours after Xu Yue issued his order, another telegram arrived from Chongqing. Chiang Kai-shek instructed that since the enemy, which had advanced into northern Hunan, had begun retreating towards Yueyang on the night of October the 1st, the 9th War Zone was to exploit their fatigue, pursue boldly, seize Yueyang if possible, sabotage the Wuyue Railway, and launch attacks, ambushes, and fierce strikes along the retreat route to prevent the Japanese from regaining their former defenses or shifting quickly towards Wuhan. The purpose was stated clearly, to facilitate the operations of the 3rd, 5th, and 6th War Zones. Xu Yue understood the message at once. The support provided by the 3rd and 5th War Zones had been limited and often symbolic. The operation that truly mattered now was Chen Cheng's assault on Yichang. Pursuit into Hunan was not simply retaliation for the threat to Changsha. It was an attempt to buy time in blood, mud, and delay. He adjusted the pursuit deployment and ordered commanders at every level to go forward and supervise their units in person. Autumn rain began to fall over northern Hunan. Hills disappeared in mist and drizzle. Along the roads leading north moved Japanese soldiers under the red rising sun. Behind them and beside them, often through the fields, villages, and broken country, moved Chinese troops under the blue sky, the white sun, and the red earth flag. Their uniforms differed, their languages differed, their causes differed, but the exhaustion in their faces must have often looked terribly alike. Both armies moved through damp air, hunger, uncertainty, and the constant expectation of another clash. The pursuit, however, revealed the limits of Chinese strength as well as its persistence. On October the 2nd, the battered remnants of the Chinese 74th and 26th armies cleared the battlefields along Liaoyang and Ladiao rivers. They found no Japanese left there. The 74th Army withdrew to Liling to regroup. The 26th halted at Jianglu Street for replenishment. Yang Sen sent the whole 27th Army group after the retreating enemy. Eugen's 4th Army attempted to intercept the Japanese 40th Division, but the Japanese maneuvered skillfully and they escaped. Eugen pursued them north of the Melo River for 3 days. They reached the Chongshui River and found the south bank empty. The 20th Army tried to cut off the Japanese 6th Division, Fulipu. At first, they could not even locate the enemy, but they did collect large amounts of material left behind. Deputy Commander Xiao Zhong remarked the rough optimism felt by everyone that the Japanese were still steaming hot and would certainly be caught. His men ran hard, crossed the Milo River, and finally did catch their rearguard. Yet the Japanese, intent only on getting away, adopted what Chinese accounts described as low-key methods of not retaliating and not becoming decisively engaged. After crossing Gaoqiao, they withdrew into their previous defensive area, and Xia could not do much more than stop, rest, and continue to watch them. The 58th Army intercepted more than 2,000 Japanese troops near Guanwang Bridge. For a moment, it seemed a major clash might erupt at any moment. Instead, the Japanese fled, leaving behind large quantities of supplies. The Chinese followed them as far as Taoyuan, and then they halted when it became clear that the enemy had regained strong ground. These episodes were quite frustrating, but they were not meaningless. They showed that many Chinese formations had been too badly mauled in the earlier phases of the campaign to sustain relentless offensive pressure. They also showed that the Japanese, though in retreat, were still disciplined enough to avoid disastrous entanglements. The Chinese units that had struck hardest during this phase were not those most damaged at the beginning of the battle, but fresher formations such as Xia Zhuozhong's 79th Army and Fu Zhongfang's 99th Army. Xia's men ambushed the Hayabuchi detachment and nearly destroyed it, killing 2 of its 3 battalion commanders. Fu's 99th Army fought a series of clashes with the Japanese 3rd and 6th divisions and with the Hirano and Araki detachments. The Japanese, eager to keep moving, absorbed losses rather than pause for extended battle. The 99th Army captured so much material that transporting it became quite a problem in itself. On October the 4th, a squad leader of the 197th Division even shot down an aircraft with a machine gun. Yet even here, success had limits. By October the 9th, the entire Japanese force in northern Hunan had crossed the Xinjiang River and reoccupied its original positions. Chinese attacks achieved nothing decisive. The river once again became, in military senses, almost a fixed frontier. As gunfire subsided in Xiangbei, all attention turned back to Yichang. The encirclement of the city was completed at noon on October the 4th. Zhang ordered a general offensive to begin at 4 in the morning on the 6th. Outside of the city, Li Yanyan's 2nd Army held fast against the Japanese 39th Division, which was trying to come in from Jingmen. Altogether, the 6th War Zone had committed 14 divisions, more than 100,000 men to the operation. What followed was the familiar but always arresting spectacle of a great battle gathering itself. Small detachments moved forward to cut wire and destroy fortifications outside of the city. Artillery officers adjusted their fire with care. Ammunition boxes changed hands continuously. Telephone operators hurried back and forth laying lines. Engineers worked with picks and shovels. Trucks forced their way down crowded roads with horns blaring. Boats were requisitioned along the riverbanks, and dark-skinned boatmen, weathered by the Yangtze wind, moved amongst the soldiers and officers. Behind the assault unit stood medical stations under the Red Cross flags, waiting for the wounded they knew were coming. All the machinery of the battle was in motion. Inside Yichang, meanwhile, another scene unfolded that could only exist in wartime Japan's peculiar mixture of militarism and performance. At the field hospital of the Japanese 13th Division, on the campus of Mingde Middle School, wounded soldiers wrapped in white bandages stood, sat, lay on stretchers, or leaned on medical orderlies in the yard watching entertainers from their homeland perform with the dull rhythms of artillery sounding off in the distance. The Asakusa Art Troupe had been founded in the mid-1920s and had made its name by combining modern, popular elements with traditional stage culture. They had first won over ordinary audiences, and then, as their reputation rose, gained acceptance amongst the official and elite circles as well. After the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War, it was gradually folded into the machinery of wartime propaganda, performing works meant to praise sacrifice, glory of the empire, and strengthen morale. When the delegation of more than 30 members arrived at the 11th Army headquarters in Wuhan, the Army added a military band of more than 20 men to accompany them to Yichang. By the time they reached the city, the battle had already drawn quite close. They could not visit the forward positions. Instead, they performed for the wounded. The last performance featured heavily made-up young men and women dancing a popular folk number. As the dance continued, the women bowed and invited medics and wounded men who could still move in to join them. Kimono and military uniforms mixed. Smiles appeared beside bandages. Music from the home islands drifted out beneath the sound of an approaching siege. It was quite a bizarre scene. Before dawn on October the 6th, Chinese artillery opened on Yichang from a deafening bombardment, and the cries of the attack rolled over all of the city. As day came up, the troop members watched stretchers being rushed into the field hospital where they had already recently performed. One of the 16-year-old twin geisha sisters, named Mihoko, asked the troop leader, Akizuru, through tears whether they would ever be able to return to Tokyo. Chihe, the famous dance artist in her 50s, answered gently that they would. General Nami, she said, was leading brave troops there and would arrive in the next few days. The child just had to pray. Outside the city, reality was quite harsher. For 2 days and nights, the fighting remained quite severe. The Japanese fell back towards the edge of the city and resisted with desperation. The Japanese 3rd Air Regiment in Hankou committed itself heavily to the defense, flying sorties after sorties over Yichang. Aircraft came so often that some made 4 round trips a single day. On the morning of the 8th, a unit of the Chinese 94th Army crossed by boat from the west bank, bypassed the Gaijuba area, and landed at the northern end of Wangcaoba. Advancing south along the embankment, it established positions on the Yangtze side, only about a half a kilometer from the city. This foothold effectively dominated Japanese positions west of Yichang. Mortar rounds crossed the water. Heavy and light machine guns pinned the defenders outside of the walls. At the same time, the 9th Division of the 32nd Army and part of the 99th Army pressed inward as well. The ring was tightening. October the 9th was grave for both sides. The Japanese withdrawal from northern Hunan had by now produced a relief force. Anami assembled elite troops from several divisions into a rapid deployment column for Yichang. For the Chinese 6th War Zone, however, victory seemed very near. Inside the city, the Japanese situation was increasingly desperate. Casualties were severe. The field hospital yard was filled with groaning wounded. Uchiyama summoned support personnel, medics, cooks, ordnance repairmen, and any wounded men still capable of firing. He armed them all and formed an improvised reserve. Then, while this force was assembling, he had heard the sound of a trumpet. One of the band members, still practicing as if the battle was not reaching its climax, reminded him that more than 20 members of the 11th Army Band were also soldiers in uniform. So he added them as well, creating a special unit of about 388 men. Hundreds of sacks of rice were taken from storage and piled around divisional headquarters as fortifications. Uchiyama then turned to Chief of Staff Akinaga and said, "Let's not believe any miracles will happen." The line was bleak and lucid. It meant that there would be no rescue through wishful thinking. If they lived, it would be because they held out long enough. If they died, they would die without pretending that destiny had cheated them out. Outside the city, Tiancheng faced a different but equally harsh pressure. On October the 2nd, Chiang Kai-shek had ordered Yichang to be taken within 3 days. On the 4th, Tiancheng requested an extension until the 8th. Chiang Kai-shek agreed, but warned that because the Japanese were retreating from northern Hunan, the city must be captured by then or all previous efforts would be wasted. Tiancheng launched the general assault on the 6th, but fierce resistance on the ground and in the air slowed them. By the 8th, the city still had not fallen. He requested another extension, asking to take Yichang by October the 10th. This time, Chiang Kai-shek sent no reply. Tiancheng understood the silence. It meant that no political room remained behind him. At 2:30 in the morning on October the 10th, the 6th War Zone opened another general offensive. 140 artillery pieces joined the bombardment. Shells fell across every part of the Japanese defenses until the repeated flashes made it hard for the gunners to tell what had not yet been hit. Then the infantry went in. Men shouted and surged forward like water breaking through a barrier. Hidden Japanese machine guns cut them down wave after wave, but more men followed behind them. The dead piled on the approaches so thickly that nationality itself seemed to vanish in blood and mud. Under that fire, dawn rose red. Uchiyama watched the sunrise from the highest building in the city, the 3-story Yichang Bank. After the war, he would tell a reporter that the sky, the earth, and even the Yangtze had all seemed red to him, as if the rivers itself were carrying the blood of Chinese and Japanese alike. According to a later Japanese account, messages reached him from every side that morning reporting of a collapse. Roughly 5,000 men were estimated killed or seriously wounded. At 8 o'clock, Uchiyama went down to the operations room. Waiting there were his chief of staff and his senior officers. At that moment, the final ritual of battlefield defeat began. A farewell telegram to Anami Korichiga was read aloud. Nearby stood the regimental flag of the 104th Regiment, entrusted to Captain Izumi Shigeru before the regiment's complete destruction. Uchiyama then took the 13th Division's own flag, the imperial military color, and laid it over the regimental flag. Officers and men wept, removed their caps, and bowed their heads. Uchiyama's hands trembled so badly that it took him 3 matches to set the flag alight. In Japanese military culture, burning a flag was amongst the sternest rites of defeat. The flag could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. To destroy it was to acknowledge annihilation, while presenting that annihilation as a final offering to the imperial state. When the flags had burned, and places for seppuku had been chosen, the farewell message remained. It declared that all officers and soldiers had done their utmost for the empire in the final, desperate struggle, that military flags, confidential documents, and imperial edicts had been burned, and that it was deeply regrettable that overseas Chinese and the delegation in Yichang had also suffered this fate. Uchiyama then added one final sentence in red pencil. The soldiers of the empire had fulfilled their duty, and died for their country amidst the heroic cries of "Long live the Grand Marshal." At 8:50, the clerk began encoding the telegram. Then Uchiyama said quietly to the officers waiting to die, "Please wait a little while longer." The words postponed death by mere minutes. There was still the narrow possibility that communication mattered, or that the battle had not yet reached its absolute end. Chief of Staff Akinaga summoned his adjutant, Sakata Uyashiro, and ordered that if the division commander and chief of staff died before the telegram was sent, Sakata was to form a suicide squad, break out by any means possible, and report the division's fate to the 11th Army headquarters. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the Japanese 39th Division, attacking from Jingmen, launched a new assault under Anami's strict orders against Li Yanyan's Second Army. One regiment used poison gas to break through part of the Chinese line and reach the outskirts of Yichang. Tian Cheng personally directed the Chinese response, using elements of the attacking force and the Second Army to surround and beat back the thrust. By 2 in the afternoon, only the Dongshan Temple line remained intact amongst the different sectors of the Japanese city defenses. Chinese troops had penetrated the city, and they were fighting bitterly within its streets, moving steadily towards the divisional headquarters. At 4 in the afternoon, more than 2,000 Japanese rapid deployment troops from northern Hunan reached the northeastern approaches of Yichang and at once joined the relief effort. Tian Cheng threw reserves in to block them, and both sides locked in combat 6 kilometers outside of the city. As dusk fell, the Chinese assault units in the city had also suffered terrible losses. Tian Cheng ordered them to regroup, replenish, and launch a final attack after dark. Then at 7 p.m., almost as the order was issued, a violent gale rose and torrential rain began to fall. Such heavy rain was unusual in the Yichang area in October, and to the men who had been living for days under the pressure of siege, death, and deadline, it must have seemed uncanny. The Chinese attacked through the downpour, but progress was painfully slow. At the same time, more than 10,000 Japanese troops were arriving from northern Hunan, reaching the outskirts. Fighting over 2 hours in the rain, they finally broke into the city, linking up with what remained of the 13th Division. At 11 p.m., Chiang Kai-shek ordered the attack on Yichang halted and instructed the Chinese troops to return to their original defensive positions. The battle ended not in a clear verdict, but in exhaustion. One elderly resident of Yichang, Huang Jiepu, later left a memory of the aftermath more vivid than any headquarters summary. He recalled that the heavy rain began at nightfall on the 20th day of the 8th lunar month, October the 10th, in the Gregorian calendar, and continued into the next afternoon. Rainwater soaked the corpses lying in the streets until the water became a deep brownish-red pool more than 2 feet deep before it drained into the Yangtze and changed the river's color. The next day, he said, both sides sent corpse collection teams into the streets under the Red Cross flags. They They pushed carts and worked separately, avoiding conflict, though sometimes they spoke to one another when trying to identify bodies. The Japanese recovery party included Chinese helpers and local residents. They turned corpses over, looked at the clothing and the weapons, and they tried to determine nationality. Some bodies were naked, perhaps stripped wounded, which made identification a little bit harder. Since Chinese and Japanese could resemble one another, neither side wanted to take the wrong dead, fearing that a mistake would disturb the heroic souls to whom each army believed had been owed a proper burial. In the end, Huang remembered it was the people of Yichang who pooled their money to bury many of the dead north of the city. Later, an unmarked stone was raised there, with a bowl of rice and a stick of incense set before it. That image does something military history often fails to do. It restores weight to the end of the battle. Armies issued attack orders, counterattack orders, pursuit orders, and retreat orders. Staff officers marked arrows on maps. Commanders calculated reinforcement and delay. But after all of that came the business of soaked bodies in the streets, identification, carts, shallow graves, and local people forced to do what armies could no longer fully do for their own dead. Seen as a whole, the operations in Hunan and Hubei during these weeks form one connected historical drama. The Japanese advance towards Changsha was real and dangerous, but it failed to produce decisive strategic gain. The battle strained the Chinese defenses quite badly. Some units collapsed. Others improvised and recovered. The city was entered, contested, and then fought over again. Behind the forward lines, Chinese forces such as Yang Sen's 27th Army Group harassed Japanese communications and supply, turning depth into vulnerability. At the same time, Chen Cheng's offensive against Yichang transformed what might otherwise have remained a local success for Japan and Hunan into a strategic dilemma. Once Yichang came seriously under threat, the Japanese command could not continue to treat the Hunan offensive as self-contained. It had to weigh possession against preservation, momentum against strategic necessity. That calculation compelled the retreat from northern Hunan. The retreat in turn changed the meaning of Shiyue's position. Pursuit became valuable not mainly because it might recover wounded pride, or even because it might damage the retreating enemy, but because every hour of delay imposed on Japanese units moving north from another hour in which Yichang might fall. Yet Yichang did not fall. That fact is central, but it must be interpreted carefully. Chen Cheng had numerical superiority and fought with determination, but numbers alone could not cancel the difficulty of assaulting a fortified Japanese position under air attack and against fanatical resistance. Time worked against him. Every day lost increased the chance that Japanese relief efforts would arrive from Hunan. Chiang Kai-shek's increasingly urgent telegrams reflected the strategic logic, but they could not abolish battlefield reality. Men still had to cross open ground, cut wire, silence guns, and survive fire. Inside Yichang, Uchiyama's defenses revealed the same pressure from the opposite side. He understood that his task was simple in principle and terrible in practice: hold until relief arrived. That necessity drove him to arm cooks, medics, repairmen, musicians, and wounded men. It drove him to build fortifications from sacks of rice. It brought him to the point of burning flags and preparing for ritual death while still delaying the final act long enough to see whether the rescue might actually come. The presence of the Asakusa art troupe inside the besieged city sharpened the tragedy. They had been sent for morale and appearance, as if cultural performance might reassure the empire already growing anxious about the costs of war. Instead, they became trapped witnesses to the near annihilation. The young girl asking if she would ever return to Tokyo cut through all this rhetoric. It is the ordinary human question that waits behind every doctrine of heroic sacrifice. In the end, neither side obtained everything that they sought. Japan failed to turn its push into Hunan into a decisive result. China failed to retake Yichang despite concentration of force and a window of opportunity that for a time seemed very real. But that does not mean the campaign resolves into a stalemate in any empty sense. It revealed important truths. For China, it showed both weakness and development. Weakness appeared in broken lines, uneven coordination, exhausted pursuit, and the inability to convert superiority in numbers into victory at Yichang. But development appeared too. A greater ability to coordinate war zones, to pressure Japanese rear areas, to force the enemy into strategic compromise, and to sustain resistance under conditions that would have once threatened outright collapse. For Japan, the campaign exposed the narrowing gap between aggressive offensive action and dangerous overextension. Japanese divisions could still strike hard, move with speed, and defend with ferocity. Their aircraft could still exact terrible cost, but logistics, fatigue, sickness, and obligation to rescue threatened positions like Yichang increasingly, limiting what offensive successes could actually mean. The deepest memory of the campaign may belong not to the generals, however, but to the smaller figures history often notices only in passing. The soldiers chewing dry rations without any water. The wounded man who blew himself up rather than submit. The old beggar who revealed the depot. The band members still practicing trumpet in the city preparing for death. The frightened girl from the troop. And the townspeople who buried the dead after the rain washed the blood into the Yangtze. The autumn of 1941 in Hunan, Hubei was not one clean victory, nor one clean defeat. It was a season in which pressure in one sector altered decisions in another, in which tactical success did not always yield strategic reward, and in which endurances itself increasingly became a form of power. That is why the campaign mattered. It showed a war whose balance had begun to change, not dramatically or conclusively, but perceptibly. China still suffered, improvised and fell short. Japan still advanced, struck hard, and held important ground. Yet the margin between them was no longer what it had been in the earlier years of the war. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and could help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Eastern Front and Pacific War Week by Week podcasts, both written and narrated by me. If after all that you want to do me a solid favor, please go check out my personal channel, the Pacific War Channel, where we just started our chronological series covering the Second Sino-Japanese War. If you'd like to support me further, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War Channel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, get early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. As Chinese pressure tightened, Japan's wider situation around Changsha deteriorated. Fatigue, supply strain, and losses accumulated. When the Japanese began retreating north, relief efforts turned Yichang into a desperate struggle marked by shifting fronts, poison gas, and street fighting. Chiang Kai-shek demanded a deadline, forcing Changchang into final assaults that ultimately failed to secure a clean victory.